happiness is an indicator of everything from our well-being through to how we feel in an organisation.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Finding Equilibrium show. Delighted to be here, delighted that you're here, and delighted that my guest today is Matt Phelan. Now, I think I met Matt probably about 7-8 years ago, right at the beginning of my own journey into wellbeing at work. Matt is the co-founder of the Happiness Index and also the author of a book by the very same title. So welcome, Matt. How are you today and where are you today?
Hey Lawrence, I'm in North London. I'm in Enfield, where weirdly you stayed for a little bit, Lawrence, last time you were in the UK, didn't you?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, just around the corner. Yeah.
It's funny thinking when you said when we met, because I remember the person who put us in touch was Ashley Friedline. And I remember meeting you because it was now things like well-being and happiness have become well established in business. But I remember meeting you and it was like meeting just like another one of the crazy people.
Yeah.
Well, at the time, it felt like the fringe work, didn't it? And I
Yeah,
thought, oh, wow,
yeah.
here's
Yeah, we were kind of early adopters in this space, weren't we? It was funny, like the world seems to have changed a lot since then. And you've done like amazing things since we met. Like right at that point, I was beginning my journey, but of course you were as well. And for people who aren't familiar with the Happiness Index, I'd love for you to just give people a sense of how you came to be the co-founder of the Happiness Index and write the book, The Happiness Index.
Yeah, it's an interesting start really, Lawrence, because like many of our clients, they don't normally find us because they have happy employees. People often find us because they have unhappiness. And our story started similar to that. I was 25 when I started my first business, and it was a marketing agency, and we were scaling quickly, but everyone was unhappy. Right. Ourselves as founders, our employees, our customers. It's a bit of an over-exaggeration to say people are unhappy, but we were struggling with how to scale this business, and it was causing stress. And at the time, we were using an adaptation of a Richard Branson quote, which is customers don't come first, your employees come first, and then your employees look after your customers. And in the agency, we'd turned it into this statement, which was personal client agency growth. And we believed at the time that this was why we were growing, because we invested in the people, they invested in the customers, and therefore we grew, and the financial elements came to it. And that seemed to be working as a statement and a way to drive us forward. However, what it wasn't doing is we weren't checking in against it, and we weren't collecting data on it to actually find out whether that was the thing that was driving us. And because we all come from a sort of a data techie background, it was weird that we were offering a service to our customers around making better decisions through data, but we weren't actually using data for our own mission statement. Right. So we went to see one of our customers, and she said to my business partner, Chris, look, you need to get a better handle on your customer happiness, because I'm not happy, which was hard to hear, but I think it's better to hear it than not, and the contract just gets resigned. So Chris brought that back to base, and we had a bit of a chat about it, and we built a rudimentary piece of technology called the Happiness Index. And it was just to track at this point the correlation between how our employees were feeling and how our customers were feeling. We hadn't got into causation and drivers of happiness like in the book. But at that point, we just wanted to see on a graph, were they correlating? Were we onto something, or should we dismiss the whole test? And then people around the edges of this kind of world, like our customers that were using it, started saying, oh, can we have that bit of tech for ourselves? And we were like, no, it's rubbish. It's just an internal tool. It's not a commercial product. But we were coming up to the point where we were going to exit that agency. So we sold the company, and then we reinvested as much as we could into the Happiness Index and went again. So it's one of those stories started with unhappiness that resulted in us building the Happiness Index.
Amazing story. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, one question that comes to mind straight away is defining what happiness is, because you're called the Happiness Index, and it is one of those words that can mean different things to different people. But how do you define happiness within the Happiness Index?
I think a good differentiator that we would use is we would differentiate between happiness and joy. in ancient Greece, they would talk about something called eudaimonia, which is your underlying happiness state, whereas joy is more associated with, say, hedonism.
Mm.
And we always split that, which is joy and hedonism are they're important parts of life. They're why people go out, they're why people go to parties and so on. But when we're talking about happiness at work, we're talking about what we would describe as that underlying state of happiness around your life and how you feel. Academic researchers would call it subjective well-being.
Okay.
Would be their definition. Our definition is we use happiness because that's the language what we describe as a normal human being uses. Like the things that we talk about when we're at parties, when we're with our friends, we say to each other, "Are you enjoying your work? Are you happy at work?" We get into the neuroscience and everything of it, but language is so important and it has to be accessible. Otherwise, it feels like something that's been done to you. Like even the word employee engagement doesn't sound like something you want to happen to you, does it?
No. Yeah.
Happiness is a universal thing that, yes, we translate it when we go to different countries and so on, but you don't have a problem having a conversation with an employee or wherever they are in the world about happiness. They all get the conversation we're there to have.
Okay, that makes sense. And just going back to something you said before, in this correlation between the happiness of employees and the happiness of customers, because that quote that you mentioned from Richard Branson, I heard that years ago, and I heard him say it, and I think that actually began my journey of well-being at work because it made so much intuitive sense, and it almost started me on that journey of thinking about employees almost as key customers, as opposed to forgetting about them and just thinking, well, people are paid money and therefore it's their job, so we can ignore them. But over the years, have you seen that correlation between the happiness of employees and the happiness of customers?
Yeah, and we still see it ourselves. Like if anyone adds me on LinkedIn, you'll see our latest customer results. So we still track it ourselves as an organization when we see it flow through. But most of our customers use us for the employee bit, but we encourage people to start to connect that data because customers is not the only bit. It's also shareholders. It's also financial results. It goes a lot further than that. But we were a service business. So understanding the happiness of customers is really key. Some people never see their customers because they're in a different type of distribution model. Most employees across the world are working in places like factories, they're working on farms, so they don't necessarily have that direct link with the customer. But happiness still has the same link through to financial performance. So customer was very important for a service business like we were. We encourage all of our customers to start to knit it up in the P&L because that's where it starts to get interesting. If well-being and happiness data just stays as a silo, I think it never gets taken seriously. And that is it's a term that I call P&L 2.0, which is like trying to innovate and change your P&L. Like just because it's been done that way, I'm getting a bit geeky, but the first original recorded financial accounts that can be found in the world go back to ancient Egypt and then into places like Greece and Rome. But we've been pretty much recording it pretty much the same way for a long time. And why not add different parts of data into P&Ls and financial accounting?
It's interesting. And since you mentioned financial accounting, what we say through Wellbeing at Work, we speak to a lot of chief people officers. And one of the big stresses that we hear is having the language to influence the chief financial officer. And because, of course, the happiness of employees, when you speak to them, or the subjective well-being of employees, nobody's going to say that isn't important, but there is often a disconnect when it comes to investing in the subjective well-being, often because it's this intangible concept and can't be measured. But what you're doing is actually measuring it. And I'd love for you to share some tips for our audience who are concerned about how to actually position well-being. They know happiness is important, but may not be able to influence the people who hold the purse strings to get investment in tools, in initiatives that could really move the dial. What would you say to those people?
So I would say it's all about storytelling, and good data is about storytelling. Even P&L is telling a story of the past. This is what happened. This is how much revenue we made. So whether someone is very traditional CFO mindset, they are still telling a story. So I personally think for a story to be told, a really comprehensive internal story like a business case, it requires three elements. Now, the first element is the data, what I'd call data science research.
Okay.
Now, that is areas that can anchor what you are saying, but that will also still be probably external. So even if you take someone like the really great studies, someone will go, yeah, but it's this different in my type of business. Like, yeah, I know that worked in those 1,000 companies in that study or whatever. And there's over 100,000 studies into this now. So there's plenty of evidence. You just go to Google Scholar, right? Happiness, productivity in your sector. You'll be able to find something that gives you some interesting stuff for your sector or your area. But still, and I've been in those meetings, still there'll be skeptics. So the second element I believe you always need is a practitioner from your business on your side. So someone that's on the ground, someone that may be in customer service, someone may be from another area of the business that's there with you, that is bringing it to life in a real life. This is what's happening in this business, because you need the macro studies. You can go to your amazing events that you do, Lawrence, and you can come back with all these stories, and they'll frame it, and they're part one. But the second part is to actually get it into your business and get those stories out, because, and this is the third point, a lot of these issues are a lack of data. If you think of the CFO really in a playing a good role, because we can demonize CFO people, but if you look at them from a good perspective, and they're just saying, well, we need some data before we make these decisions. So obviously it'd be great if everyone worked with a happiness index, but that's not going to happen. But you can still collect data yourself and start to connect them up, like how many people resigned, what the retention rate is, what impact that was on the customers, how that meant that training didn't get passed on. You can bring all these elements together, but the bit that knits it all together is storytelling. And then I suppose that this isn't in the 3 points, but this is a fourth point. I always get people to bring it back to themselves. So I always say to someone, do you work better when you're unhappy? And getting people to feel and think about, because reversing the question is also really powerful. Right now, we're talking about the business case for happiness. So if someone asks you the business case for happiness, this would be a very aggressive way to put it. But what's the business case for unhappiness? What's the business case for us to keep not looking after our employees? What's the business case for ignoring mental health? Put in the right way, it makes people flip it around. 4-day work week would be a good one. So what's the business case for the 5-day work week? Because the main business case for the 5-day work week is that that's how we've always done it. I'd love to see the data on why the 5. I'm not pro either way. I'm not pro or against the 5-day work week. But if you're going to ask people for a business case on the 4-day work week, what's the business case on the 5-day work week?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. So it's about telling stories, about collecting the data, having the data, and then building the story around that data. I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into the happiness index. So you clearly have now been doing this business for, how long is it, 7, 8 years now?
It's coming up for 10 years now.
10 years,
I reckon,
wow. It would be a decade. Yeah, that's when we met, a decade
yeah,
ago.
I think the company's 10 years this May. We founded it on my birthday. That's weird, isn't it? That's what I was doing on my birthday. So I have the same birthday as Alex. And the founders are weird, as you know. But I think we've been collecting data for probably about 12 years. So the limited company is coming up for its birthday, but we were collecting data in the agency before we were a company.
Yeah, I get confused because I've lived here for 7 years in Australia, whereas of course it was 10 years that we met. So where is the happiness index now? Like, what data are you collecting? I'd love you to just illustrate how the happiness index helps organizations understand the happiness of their employees, and then take action on that.
The way that we frame it is only about 60% of companies are actually measuring the traditional term, which is employee engagement. And they may be, a lot of the platforms use, for example, employee net promoter score as their metric. So there's a lot of companies that are doing that. Now, the issue with that is most of those ways of working are based on traditional psychology, and they are based on how an employee thinks. But they're not very good at understanding how someone feels, which I know it's a small point, but the data is drastically different. How someone thinks about their work is very different to how someone feels. So if I brought up the data now, and I think you can do this on our website, I'll have to check that we still put it live. You'll see how different employee engagement are and employee happiness are. Now, the way that we storytell that from the data is because we have loads of data and then we have to tell the story as well. So we always say employee engagement is what your brain needs at work. It's things like clear direction.
Mm-hmm.
Happiness is what your heart needs. It's things like positive relationships.
Mm.
Now, quite often in the boardroom, you get some people that I don't know, left brain, right brain is a little bit outdated now,
Mm.
but you'll get some people that are more emotionally intelligent than others.
Mm.
And that's not a right or a wrong thing, but some people are really good at connecting the dots, and
Mm-hmm.
some people are good at knowing their bit. And I think ultimately, there's loads of stuff that drive us, and we're aware of it in our private life and is important, like relationships, but it gets ignored. So what happens is companies track employee engagement. The engagement metrics are really high, but then everyone resigns.
Yeah.
And,
That's
and everyone's
interesting.
going, everyone's looking at HR and they're going, well, the metrics said it's good. And that's because they're tracking how people think rather than how people feel.
Yes.
So an example of that would be, let's take a really serious subject like racism. If you ask 100 employees at work, are you racist? A rational question, most people are going to say, no, I am not. But when you explore more emotions around how people may feel about immigration, you're getting into a deeper understanding. So that's obviously a really serious subject, but that can also apply to anything. So we are delving into how someone thinks, but we're adding what we say another layer of understanding, which actually the HR directors where the metrics are high, they know in their gut, people are not happy even though their metrics are saying everything's okay. HR can sometimes get a bad name because they're sometimes the people who have to fire people.
Mm.
But really, most people in HR are decent people that are emotionally intelligent, and they always know. And now they're just looking to have a layer of data into there. So we do levels, but we add that extra level in.
How do you get that level of emotional data? I completely agree. If you're only focused on the head, then you miss out the heart, and the heart and the way people feel is a huge driver. I think you put this in your book in terms of how you unlock the emotions of your people and really direct that energy in a particular direction. But how can you track that? How do you know how your workforce are actually feeling at any point in time?
So there's a range of surveys. Some are like every 6 months, some are 24/7. So there's a product called Employee Voice 24/7 within the Happiness Index platform, and it's just looking for the pulse. That is the up and down bit. That is more related to hedonism. But what we're categorizing and what we're asking about fit into, I've simplified it by saying two areas, but the four types of data that we collect are instinctive, emotional, rational, and reflective.
Mm.
So how you felt about when you worked at company Z may be different if you ask someone when they worked there versus when they left and they thought about it 6 months later.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why traditionally people don't like tracking it, because rational data, it's not messy. It's black and white. It can be put in a box. You can put it in an Excel spreadsheet and you work it like revenue. Revenue up's good, revenue down's bad. And you look at that like employee engagement data. However, it's normal for emotions to go up and down. And this is one of the major issues with measuring emotions. Emotions are not supposed to be high all the time. It's normal for our happiness to fluctuate. So I often, if I meet people and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" and I just give them a little headline about the happiness index, they always joke. They'll go, "Oh, you must be happy all the time, then, Matt." But I'm not. And if you were happy all the time, it would be absolutely draining of your own resources and other those around you. And we'll come back to the name of this podcast in a bit. But it is about understanding that you learn as much from your negative emotions as your positive emotions. So some people, when they read the name, the happiness index, they subconsciously insert the name high in there. So they think we're called the high happiness index, but we're not. What we're doing is we are measuring how people feel so you can improve the culture, which is a really important distinction, because let's say you work in a small company and someone's died recently, it's going to be normal that people are going to be unhappy.
Mm.
And having like a target for happiness would be really detrimental to that small team where someone that they've worked with every day has passed away, and then you're suddenly like, oh my god, everyone needs to be happy.
Mm.
So it's a complex area and it is a messy area to work in, but in my opinion it definitely makes companies more emotionally intelligent when they start looking at the group data on how someone feels, because you know yourself how you feel,
Yeah.
but you don't know how everyone around you feels, and that's where data comes in.
No, and it's that collective. I think we've answered this question in many ways, but for leaders who are listening to this podcast, who are struggling, who kind of get the importance of happiness, but are struggling to do anything about it, let's say, apart from some tokenistic things, which are pretty common, why should they worry about the happiness of their workforce?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Because let's say you're a CEO, you think your job is right, let's just get more sales in, let's get the share price up. Now, before I wrote the happiness index, I wrote a book called Freedom to be Happy, the business case for happiness. But essentially, the top lines are, if you're happier at work, you're more productive, you're more creative, you sell more, you're more accurate in your task. And the longest study into it by Professor Alex Edmonds over 28 years shows that company with happier employees outperform their peers on the American stock market. So there are loads of factors that all lead to better financial performance, but it all comes back to the fact is, if you're unhappy, you're in a fight or flight mode. If you're unhappy, you're either thinking, how do I run away from this situation, or I'm fighting everyone, or I'm fighting everything, I'm fighting life. And you're not in that state. So if we think of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the bit that differentiates us as human beings, that's where things like creativity sit. If you are worried and you're in fight or flight and you're worried that this bear, this imaginary bear is going to destroy you, your body is shutting down to give you the energy to fight or flight. Or now we know freeze and flop, which is also another conversation.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one. Interesting.
Yeah, and then anyone who's got children, I mean, my children go into flop all the time. Which is a challenge I have as their parent. But our job is to get people to be thinking creatively, to be differentiating ourselves. Look at the world of AI. Look how many tasks can be automated. Therefore, the things like creativity are even more important. So you are hiring people. Let's say, I don't know what the average wage is in Australia, but let's not use pounds or dollars for a second. Let's say the average wage in this country we've just made up is 50,000. I'm trying to look what's right. 50,000.
50,000, whatever.
Whatever it is. You're hiring these people, right? It's your job to make sure that those people in that seat or doing that role that are performing to their best. And us as human beings, if we're in that fight or flight mode, we're not going to. And happiness, and this is where the other part of the name comes from, it's an indicator. So it's not the high happiness index, it's a happiness indicator. And happiness is an indicator of everything from our well-being through to how we feel in an organization. So the happiness is the first emotion we get into. We get into all of them. But I look at happiness more like a weather forecast. So if the forecast tells you it's going to rain, you bring an umbrella. If it's going to tell you it's going to be really hot and then you're in Australia, you bring your sun cream. When you know your people are unhappy, it's an indicator, it's a forecast as a leader for you to go, okay, there's a situation here. What things can I do to make the situation better so that my people can focus? Just like if you lived in London and your office didn't have a roof on it and it was raining in on all the employees all the time and they couldn't get their work done on their laptop.
They're not going to be so happy.
You go, maybe we should put a roof on this building. But that's because we're used to thinking about architecture, but the body and the mind and all these things, we have to think of it like that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in today's age of hybrid working, when we met 10 years ago and I was running a wellbeing program, I had a lot of staff in remote offices and I didn't know how those people were feeling. But I think it's an important point for people who are increasingly managing remote teams working at home to have tools where they can understand how happy their employees are, because everyone's got their own context, their own story, and you really don't know. And I think that's a starting point. Now, we haven't even got into what can you do about it, but that's a conversation for another day. I think that the first point is starting with how happy are your people or how unhappy are your people. So the last question I always ask all of my guests is this podcast is called the Finding Equilibrium Show. And as the co-founder of a business, I'd love to know what finding equilibrium means to you personally and what you do to maintain your own sense of balance or your own sense of happiness more of the time. Just picking up on your earlier point, it's not about all the time, but more of the time. So your baseline is more positive.
So for me, equilibrium is happiness. And obviously that's because I think about it all day because I'm working on it. But again, it's not low happiness or high happiness. It's just listening to my body and my mind around happiness. And again, this is probably a weird answer because I'm in the data all the time. I think of emotions as data points. So I try and listen to myself and think, why am I feeling unhappy here? Why am I feeling happy here? And I try and learn from those points. And over time, a bit like the waves of the sea, I try and just understand that it's going to wash in and it's going to wash out. But when there's serious stuff, like there's something I'm really unhappy about for a long period of time, I have to like eat that frog, as they say. Like I have to go and do something about it. But I also understand that it's normal. Some days you're going to feel higher, sometimes you're going to lower, and I just let it wash through. And probably the biggest change that I made for happiness and equilibrium was to give up alcohol.
Right.
For me, I realized that alcohol was like a happiness loan where you borrow happiness, you borrow it for, you get it for Friday night, and then you pay it back over the next couple of days. And I worked out that it was breaking my happiness equilibrium because I did the data research on it. I did probably at least a year's data on it. And I realized by tracking it, alcohol makes me unhappier over time. So that's just one small change that I made. I'm always just listening and thinking, well, I wonder if this thing that I do or that area I work in, is that really good for my equilibrium?
I love that. I could ask you many, many questions about just what you've said, but sadly we are out of time. But we must come back for another episode in the future. But Matt, thank you very much for your time and for sharing. Let me acknowledge you for the amazing work that you're doing. Where can people find out more about you? I mean, here's your book. I'll just kind of show that for people watching this rather than listening to it. So the happiness index, why today's employee emotions equal tomorrow's business success. So congratulations on the book. Where can people find a copy? Where can people engage and reach out to you?
Thanks, Lawrence. Just go to your local book provider and Google the happiness index or put it in. If you're interested in the happiness index, go to thehappinessindex.com. If you're interested in perhaps as a speaker or something like that, go to mattphelan.co.uk. But if you've got any questions or anything, add me on LinkedIn. I'm on a bit of a social media break, so I always take December and August off social media. So if you've got a specific question that came up today, just drop me a note on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Matt. And thank you, everyone, for your time and for your attention. And we will see you soon. You take care now.